Symposium. Next, we're going to have Dr. Dylan Jackson. He's an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and he will discuss the mental health consequences of police stops for at-risk youth.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. So today, I'm going to discuss exactly what Jessie was saying, the importance of this topic of police stops. From a criminological perspective, sometimes this is overlooked, despite the fact that youth often, their first point of contact with the criminal justice system is the police, and it doesn't always result in formal processing. And so it's a really important area of inquiry that has been overlooked up to this point largely. Next slide, please. So I was really interested at the onset of this project with my collaborators, Alex Testa, Dan Semenza, and Michael Vaughn, about what police contact actually looks like and whether or not the form that it takes might influence health, particularly mental health. And so as we know, police contact is not uniformly hostile or aggressive. It can take many forms. And so it's kind of a question of whether a more procedurally just approach and a more healing-centered approach to interacting with youth could be beneficial and potentially ward off mental health consequences in comparison to something that might be hostile or aggressive or even violent. Next slide, please. And so the question is, how could this impact the mental health of youth? We already know, the numbers indicate that mental health is a significant issue that is growing in many regions of the world. Suicide is currently the third leading cause of death among youth ages 10 to 24, according to the National Council for Behavioral Health. And roughly 1 in 5 children ages 13 to 18, so adolescents, have or will have a serious mental illness. And so the question is, to what extent could aggressive and violent policing be contributing to this among youth in the United States? Next slide, please. And so to date, there has not been an extensive body of research on youth police contact and health. In the past couple of years, we've seen a growth in this literature, however. So this literature suggests that exposure to police contact can lower self-reported health among youth. This study was by McFarland and colleagues in Social Science and Medicine last year. And then Juan del Toro and his colleagues have a project from last year as well, a publication that shows that psychological distress can increase in the face of police contact among Black and Latinx youth, which can in turn escalate delinquency. And so far, there is some evidence to suggest that these effects, these negative mental health and physical health effects, can be attenuated in cases where youths are satisfied with their treatment. And so this speaks to the need to get more at the context and the features of the stop to assess whether or not it really is having an impact on the health and mental health of youth. Next slide, please. And so in this study, what we did was we added to the literature in a few different ways. First, we were able to assess the context and features of these stops. We also were able to measure emotional and mental health outcomes that were asked in direct reference to the stop, which was really useful in this case. We also used strategic comparisons to other stopped youth, given that we used an at-risk urban-born sample, which were disproportionately represented, among youth who had been stopped. So we were able to have adequate statistical power to do so. Next slide, please. And so the data we use are the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study, a very well-known data set of children who were born to unmarried couples, often low income, between 1998 and 2000 across 75 hospitals in the United States, specifically in 20 large US cities. And the study was designed with the intent to improve the lives of disadvantaged children. So that in this particular project, we use data from the most recently available wave when youth are on average 15 years of age. They're currently in the process of collecting data for the 22-year-old wave, which will be coming out in years ahead. And so initially there were about 5,000 participants, but by year 15, we had 3,444 youth who were asked about their experiences with the police, and 918, which is roughly 27%, reported that they had experienced at least one police stop during the course of their life. Next slide, please. And so in terms of measurement, I won't spend too much time, but emotional distress, social stigma, and post-traumatic stress were available in these data, and they were asked in direct reference to the stop or the most salient police stop if they had multiple stops. And so emotional distress taps into feelings of safety, fear, or anger during the stop. Safety was reverse coded, and we created a composite measure of this construct. Social stigma speaks more to the concept of avoidance and stigma surrounding or following the stop. And so people have avoided you, people have used the fact that you were stopped to hurt your feelings. You've had to hide the fact that you were stopped from family and friends. So there's a shame surrounding the stop. And then with post-traumatic stress, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a scale that gets at physical and mental health manifestations of stress and post-traumatic stress. So things such as thinking about the stop can cause sweating, trouble breathing, pounding heart. Images of the stop pop into your head even when you don't want them to, and items of that nature. Next slide, please. And in terms of police encounters, we're able to tap into a few different ideas here. So there's the contextual features of the stop, which include age at first stop, and we categorize this as 13 years of age or younger at the time of the first stop. The number of stops, right? So many youth, more than half of youth had experienced multiple stops, so we included the number of stops here. And then stop location, which is up to this point really been overlooked. We were able to look at whether youth were stopped on the street, stopped at school, or stopped in other locations. And then officer intrusiveness, which in 2017, Amanda Geller was the first to use this scale. And so in many respects, it does represent police violence. So I'll just note that. But intrusion or intrusiveness has been the commonly used term for these data. This includes frisking, searching, forms of verbal violence and psychological violence, including racial slurs, harsh language, and then threats and actual use of physical force. We also included a seventh item that tapped into whether handcuffs were used in the absence of an arrest, because for most of these youth, upwards of 84 or 85%, an arrest had not occurred. So, next slide, please. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through these covariates, but these were all the covariates and multivariate models. We performed univariate descriptive statistics as well as bivariate patterns by race and ethnicity, and then various multivariate analyses. Next slide, please. So some key descriptives: 39% of the youth were 13 or younger at the time of their first stop. The vast majority of youth had reported being stopped on the street, but nearly 1 in 4 reported being stopped at school, so not a negligible amount. The average number of stops was 2.5. And then just to highlight the emotional distress, stigma, and trauma, these were not zero inflated. They were, slightly positively skewed, but almost normally distributed in that sense. So there was quite a bit of mental health impact and trauma to go around. Next slide, please. And so just to quickly review this, there were discrepancies and disparities by race and ethnicity in terms of the degree of officer intrusiveness, particularly among Black and Latinx youth, and particularly among Black youth. And so just to highlight one feature of this particular figure, if you compare Black youth, who are the column in red, to white and other youth, who are the column in green, virtually all of these are statistically significant in terms of the difference between Black and white youth, with the exception of handcuff, no arrest. Next slide, please. And so multivariate findings revealed that young at first stop was not associated with the outcomes as we anticipated. So this did not support the hypothesis that age would potentially influence the mental health response to the stop. However, a greater number of stops was associated with higher emotional distress as well as greater post-traumatic stress, but not social stigma. And then stops at school were related to each of the mental and emotional health outcomes, even though stops on the street were not associated with these outcomes. Next slide, please. And for the sake of time, I won't go through each of these, but this shows you in the multivariate models each form of officer intrusiveness as it relates to the mental health outcomes. And as you can see, they're consistently significant. Regardless of which particular form of intrusiveness or violence you look at here, they're predicting all of the outcomes and are consistently significant. Next slide, please. And this will just show you in a visual that this is the predicted percentile score is what you see on your y-axis. And then on the x-axis, you see the 3 categories of emotional and mental health. And using the count measure of that violence and intrusiveness, you see that as violence and intrusiveness goes up, each of these forms of mental health strain and poor mental health are increasing quite significantly. So these findings are not just significant, they're actually substantive as you move from no intrusiveness to very high levels of intrusiveness. Next slide, please. So key conclusions, just to summarize, stopped youth exhibit the highest levels of emotional distress, social stigma, and post-traumatic stress when they experience 3 things: when they're stopped multiple times, when they're stopped at school, and when they experience higher levels of officer intrusiveness. In many cases, this would represent forms of police violence. And this held after adjusting for an array of relevant factors, including prior delinquency and substance use during the preteen years. Next slide, please. And so for policy, there's a number of conversations I would love to have with all of you because it's clearly very relevant in the current moment that we're in. And there's a lot of questions surrounding the role of racism in public health and policing. And to the extent that that can be examined further in more detail, we'd be much better off. But in terms of what we can say from these particular findings, we do know that there's a greater sensitivity to stigma and shame, in particular in the school setting when a police stop occurs. And so this raises questions that's consistent with some current research by Gottfredson and colleagues that just came out in Criminology and Public Policy about the need for school resource officers and the extent to which they may be criminalizing discipline efforts and might be contributing to the school to prison pipeline, whether that's intentional or unintentional. There's evidence that this could be occurring and that this is highly skewed by race and ethnicity. A number of other questions remain in terms of how can we engage in systematic evaluation of patrolling and stopping strategies, particularly when it comes to youth and youth of color, and ways that we might enhance the skill set and the training of officers to the extent possible to particularly address adolescent development and the needs of adolescents. And collaboration between different service providers could be very useful here. I do, in terms of mental health screenings and counseling care in the face of stops, but of course, system-wide change is needed, and a reimagining of policing and a dismantling of historically racist and unequal structures is very important as well. And these are conversations that continue to be needed. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson, for such an interesting presentation. Next, we're going to have Joseph Wertz. Joseph is a research assistant with the Harvard Injury Control Research Center, and he will present a typology of police-involved lethal shootings and related racial disparities.
Thank you, Jessie. My name is Joey Wertz. I'm currently a second-year medical student at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Formerly with the Harvard Injury Control Research Center. Today I'm going to go over a typology of firearm legal intervention homicide with an emphasis on the youngest victims. So next slide, please. No conflicts of interest. Next slide, please. Okay, so we know that roughly 1,000 people are shot and killed by police acting in the line of duty each year. In the academic literature, we refer to these deaths as firearm legal intervention homicide. I'll abbreviate that as LIH. Programs do collect data on these deaths at the national level, including the Washington Post Fatal Force Project, the Gun Violence Archive, and Mapping Police Violence. These large national databases are validated in count. And briefly, I'll just highlight the age distribution here, where we see that child and adolescent victims are rare among legal intervention homicide victims, but that if we expand the age range to include young adults, young victims make up 18%, roughly 1 in 6 victims of LIH. And so we see that there's certainly a burden among young people when it comes to legal intervention homicide. Unfortunately, these large nationally representative databases lack a lot of detailed victim and incident information. So in 2018, to explore a typology of firearm legal intervention homicides, my colleagues and I used the National Violent Death Reporting System for reasons I'll go over in a minute. And we published our findings in the Journal of Urban Health, describing a typology that was created. The findings are mostly applicable to people of all ages, but for this presentation, I'll focus on the youngest victims. Next slide, please. So using a validated case identification process, we identified 603 firearm LIH victims in the 2014-2015 NVDRS. That was 11 states in 2014, 16 states in 2014, expanded to 27 in 2015. And that 23% of our sample were victims 25 and younger. So NVDRS includes incident abstracts that summarize the coroner and medical examiner, as well as the law enforcement incident reports. And so my colleagues and I read through these incident reports and extracted LIH specific variables that really captured the context and characteristics of the incident. Variables included, were police responding to an in-progress event? What brought the victim and police together? What was the nature of the call, essentially? Was it a domestic violence? Was it a routine traffic stop? Suspicious person, etc.? What level of violence immediately preceded the shooting? In other words, what was the victim doing right before police pulled the trigger? Was the victim impaired or suicidal? They could have been impaired by alcohol, drugs, perhaps mental illness. Did the police use non-deadly force during the incident? Did they go straight to firearm, or did they attempt non-lethal force? We then used these data elements that we collected from the incident abstracts and created a mutually exclusive and exhaustive typology using latent class analysis. Latent class analysis essentially identifies subtypes of events and assigns each incident membership to one latent class. And then each latent class we refer to as a subtype. Notably, I just want to point out here that demographic variables were not used for the creation of the typology, but we did stratify by latent class post hoc, and I'll present those results later. Next slide, please. So briefly, our latent class analysis identified 7 subtypes of legal intervention homicide, firearm legal intervention homicide. I'll walk us through all 7 now, starting with classes 1 and 2. And I grouped classes 1 and 2 together here because for both, police encounter the victim because police are responding to a violent in progress event. Class 1 LIH, police encounter a victim who uses a firearm against them, whereas class 2 LIH, the victims are wielding knives and assaulting LE with a knife. I would also like to point out that class 2 LIH were the LIH most likely to involve domestic violence, meaning the violent in progress event police were responding to were most often, 90% of the time, domestic violence. Now, let me draw your attention to the statistics on the page. Under class 1, for example, 26% of all LIH. What this means is that 26% of our LIH sample fell into class 1 LIH category. And roughly equal proportions of LIH involving the youngest victims, 27%, and LIH involving victims 26 and older, 26% were class 1. So that's how you can interpret those statistics going forward. Next slide, please. So class 3 and class 4 are grouped together because police encounter the victim when police are responding to a nonviolent in progress event. Think routine traffic stop, perhaps a call for a suspicious person walking down the street. Class 3 incidents are like class 1 in that the victims ultimately assault law enforcement with a firearm. Class 4 are different in that the victims assault law enforcement with knives. But most notably about class 4 is that these class 4 victims are most likely of any victims to be impaired, suicidal, or both at the time of the incident. Fortunately, class 4 incidents are rare, and they're even more rare among the youngest victims. Next slide, please. So class 5 are different in that police are pursuing a wanted person, and the best way to think about these LIH are when police are serving warrants and they encounter a person who responds with force, namely using a firearm against law enforcement. Next slide, please. So class 6 LIH are perhaps our most notable and topical LIH, in that these are events in which the narrative lacked or did not suggest any threat to law enforcement immediately preceding the shooting, meaning the victims did not threaten nor assault law enforcement right before law enforcement pulled the trigger. Most of these victims are unarmed, something along the lines of 75% are unarmed. And when we look at the age distribution, it's the youngest victims are twice as likely to be involved in class 6 LIH as are victims 26 and older. Next slide, please. And our final class are motor vehicle assaults on law enforcement. For class 7, weapon was not as important because victims were maneuvering a motor vehicle in an aggressive fashion towards police, and police responded by shooting at the victims in an attempt to stop the car. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, demographics were not used in the creation of the typology, meaning the basic demographic information, age, sex, race, were not included in the latent class analysis and did not drive the differentiation of incidents into subtypes of LIH. But when we looked by latent class at how demographics distributed, perhaps not surprisingly, we noticed that they do not distribute evenly. Given the topic of this mini symposia, I thought it most appropriate to highlight race. And if we look first at the total column, we can see that that the narrative, and consistent with all of the prior research, is that we see massive racial disparities in fatal police violence, specifically firearm LIH in this case. Perhaps even more concerning is that among the younger victims, we see this disparity even to a greater extent. The other thing I would like to point out on this slide is if we look at class 6, which are LIH characterized by no apparent objective threat to law enforcement, usually involving an unarmed victim, we see that the racial disparities are at their most extreme, and that even within class 6, among the younger victims, they exist even to a greater extent. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, by using an empirical methodology, namely LCA, we were able to identify subtypes that were not previously identified. Largely, LIH subtypes have been focused on suicide by cop versus not, as well as a dichotomy between unarmed and armed victims. And so using an empirical and exhaustive methodology, we were able to allow the entire sample to inform the patterns of characteristics among LIH incidents. Similar, but not to the same extent, younger victims of LIH were largely grouped in class 1, 2, 3, or 4 firearm LIH. Those are the permutations of police responding to either a violent or non-violent in-progress event. And also victims are largely armed, the vast majority on the order of 90 to 95% of victims. But then if we look at our perhaps most concerning class, class 6, characterized by no threat to law enforcement immediately precipitating the shooting, younger victims are twice as likely to be represented in that class. And then a majority of victims were non-white in the younger victim class, whereas 41%, which is still a marker of unequal representation compared to the general population, were non-white in the older victim class. And so, and then these disparities were worse in our class 6. And so that is the typologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Webster. He's a professor of American Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and a faculty consortium member. He will share key research findings to help us understand the role of race in police killings and the effect of handgun purchasing policies on that problem.
Thanks, Jesse. If we could advance the slide, there's the title of my talk. You can go one more, please. Thank you. So many of you may have heard police violence is gun violence, and here's part of the evidence. Over 90% of the time, law enforcement officers kill a civilian, it's by shooting them. Next slide, please. I think it's important to note, as troubling as the images of unarmed individuals shot and killed by police officers, firearms do play a role in this on the victim side as well. So over 50% of individuals who are shot by law enforcement are indeed armed. Most recent year available, 57%. And the share of the victims who are unarmed is trending down a little bit, most recently around 15%. Next slide, please. Now, it is well known that there's disparities in the rate at which Blacks are killed by law enforcement, roughly 2.5 times the rate of whites, and Hispanics in between whites and Blacks. Next. Now, one back, please, sorry. This is the percentage of victims that are killed by police who are unarmed based on the race of the victim. You see 12% of whites, 14% of Hispanics, and 17% of Blacks are unarmed when they're killed by law enforcement officers. So there are clearly racial disparities, but it's also important to note that, again, most are armed who are shot. Next. These are some data from a research study published a couple of years ago by Messick and colleagues in the Journal of National Medical Association. The color codes across our states are the racism index of structural racism, looking at employment, education, law enforcement, and housing indicators. And the numbers there are the ratio of Black unarmed victims killed by police versus whites. And you'll see a correlation that is clear in the next slide, in the next graph. Thank you. So you see, again, as structural racism increases, the ratio of Black to white unarmed victims killed by police increases. So clearly, structural racism is playing a role in our racial disparities that we see in victimization. Next slide, please. This is a photo image. I couldn't show the whole video, frankly, it's very traumatizing to see, but many of you may have seen the shooting of Philando Castillo by a police officer in Minnesota a few years ago. Mr. Castillo was a licensed firearm carrier, had a permit to carry a gun, noted that to the law enforcement officer who pulled him over for a minor traffic offense, and his murder was filmed by his fiance in that tragic incident. It really sort of highlights, again, where race and firearms come together to escalate situations in the response, lethal response by law enforcement. Next slide, please. These data show you the share of 911 emergency calls in which police respond, and police respond with force with their firearms. On the x-axis at the bottom is the percentage of residents in the neighborhood who are Black, and the y-axis is the percent of calls in which police use police force with a gun. And there are two lines, one for Black officers in blue and orange for white officers. In both cases, you see as the neighborhood has proportionally more Blacks, there is more use of force with firearms, but that disparity is much more jarring when you look at white officers versus Black officers. Next. Now, some really important research was published a couple of years ago by David Hemingway and colleagues that looked at what factors explain variation in police killings of civilians across states. Looking at a range of social indicators, but also keyed in on the prevalence of firearm ownership in those states. And these data here simply show the so-called high gun states, which is the darker bar with the higher rates of civilian killings by law enforcement, and the low gun states based upon the prevalence of, so these are roughly the same populations in terms of numbers, but very grossly different with respect to gun ownership rates and also with respect to civilians killed by law enforcement. On the right-hand side, it's civilians killed with firearms. So it's about a 4-to-1 ratio overall and about a 5-to-1 ratio when you look at civilians killed when they were armed with a firearm. Next slide, please. So our team at Johns Hopkins has been studying ways in which we regulate firearm sales, particularly with respect to background check requirements and licensing of purchasers. And what we've noted is some stark differences that I'll get to in a minute, but now looking at this key indicator, key outcome of police killings per 100 million population, we see very much lower rates of civilians killed by law enforcement in places where there are purchaser licensing systems in place. When you compare that to no background checks or licensing, it's about a 4-to-1 ratio. Next slide, please. And again, these rate differences are even more dramatically different and much, much lower for licensing, purchaser licensing states when you look at civilians who were killed by law enforcement when they were armed. Next slide. Here I wanted to look at the population under age 20 who were killed by law enforcement. We looked at a much broader span of data over a span of 7 years. And on the left-hand side is the total rates, and on the right-hand bars are instances in which the victims were armed with a firearm. Again, you see much, much lower rates, in particularly lower rates for young people who were armed with guns when they were killed by law enforcement. Next slide. This sort of brings me to the much broader point. When we've been studying licensing again for a number of years, we see that licensing of purchasers reduces diversions of guns for criminal use. It reduces homicides, including mass shootings. It's associated with lower rates of suicides, lower rates of law enforcement officers shot in the line of duty. And even though what I shared with you today are cross-sectional associations, my hunch is that this broader research that does look at longitudinal change pretty consistently shows that licensing leads to fewer firearms in risky situations that police respond to, whether that's a mental health crisis, a domestic violence call, or something in the community. Next slide. So just some concluding thoughts. Structural racism leads to policing models, more stops, arrests, officer use of guns that increase police killings of blacks. Prevalence of firearms in high-risk situations and police respond are going to lead to more civilians of all races, but particularly blacks, who are killed by police. And more police engagement in the context of structural racism with wide firearm prevalence, particularly among high-risk in high-risk situations, is going to lead to more civilians shot. So one among many things that we should be thinking about to reduce these killings, in addition to changes in policing, is gun policies that are going to put fewer guns into risky situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Webster. So now we have some questions. We have a little bit of time for questions. So I am going to go through some of the Q&A discussion and go through questions for each of the panelists. So I am going to start with a question for Dr. Kumodzi. And now I lost the question. I had it. But I'm going to start with that question and then I will proceed. So Dr. Kumodzi, some of our audience is wondering, how did you come about in getting access to the data and just doing the study?
Sure. So I actually got access to the data after I interviewed during my first semester of the PhD program for an NIH study through the Minority Health International Research Training Program, MHERT. I interviewed to be a graduate assistant on a project there. It was CBPR, and so they identified that they wanted information on obesity and diabetes, which was rising in the Federation. The principal investigator, Dr. Janita Richardson, when I told her what my primary research interest was, she said, oh, well, they're looking for someone in the Federation to do work in in violence research, to support them in that regard. So I did go there, and over 2 months, I did work in diabetes and obesity. And then every summer after that, I came back to the Federation. I was a GA for a public health course on social determinants of child health. I then, the next summer, came and did my pilot study, and then the final summer I did my dissertation study. So it started from building the relationships in the Federation through the diabetes study, and then them knowing I did violence work to actually doing this work.
Thank you. And access to the data, how difficult was that? I know that in the States, when you're trying to get this type of data, sometimes there's a lot of difficulty. Did you find, how did you find that process?
Sure. So I had the support of the Ministries of Health, the police force. I actually had to go to the Bastille Police Headquarters, and 6 of the top brass interviewed me around the table and asked me a lot of questions. And then over the 2 years, so they gave me access to the NEVIS data first, and then I did work with that, continually followed up. A new police commissioner came in during that time, and then I worked with him for the final research data. So it was actually one-on-one. People really want to work with you and see if they can trust you and if you're honest and if you're competent. So it was actually on the personal relationship that actually gave me access to the work and making good on what I said I was going to do.
Seems like some things don't change. And
yeah.
It's the same way that things are here.
Right.
Thank you so much. So next I have a question for Dr. Jackson. And the question is, what are some useful approaches to minimizing the negative health impact of police stops among youth?
Well, thank you so much for asking that question. So I think there's so many different ways that we could address this. I think it needs to be a multi-pronged, multi-system approach. So obviously there's system level approaches that, you know, in terms of these conversations about reallocating resources to other services, particularly mental health services for youth, but also questions about how we can enhance the knowledge of officers concerning adolescent development. It's something that I'm really passionate about, really interested in, to understand ways that officers might enhance their understanding and their knowledge of the teenage brain and social development and these other features of adolescence that are quite unique to that stage of the life course. Given that they interact so frequently with youth, it's a really important component of their training. So I think there's a number of things that can be done to mitigate this, but obviously preventing this type of intrusiveness and violence would be paramount, and there's lots of different ways to do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. It sounds like we probably need to add this in the curriculum of the police academy, particularly for those officers that are going to be working within schools. Thank you so much. I have a question for Joseph. So most of the research in criminology, particularly done by policing scholars, generally find that place matters. And specifically what it finds is that police differently depending on crime rates within a community, the levels of social organization. Research generally find that they're more aggressive in these areas. So I know you didn't examine that exactly in your paper, but how would you think moving forward with your research, you will take into account these findings from policing scholars on place?
Yeah, what I would love to do is have encounter level data and not just have the fatal violence, because then we can maybe extract, creating a typology, maybe one of the outcomes you could stratify on afterwards is, did this encounter with these types of incident characteristics, did this lead to a death or did this lead to a non-violent resolution? And maybe we could identify patterns of incident characteristics that are more conducive to a non-fatal outcome. And so that, and maybe one of those characteristics could be place. One of the things talked a lot about in the literature is the danger towards both police and also the civilians in situations that are in domestic settings. I imagine largely that's because of easy access to firearms. 33% of homes on average across the nation have firearms. And so that in that situation, the setting makes it more dangerous, and or police might have a prior that is based on at more easy access to firearms. So that I would have encounter level data is how I would answer that.
I know some people that have that data. We should talk afterwards. Thank you so much.
Oh, I think you're muted, Jesse.
Jesse, I think you're still muted. There you go.
Am I better now? Okay, sorry about that. So my next question is for Dr. Webster. Any thoughts on how the data on police and community match might look like for kids only? Would it be the worst or the same, or any disparities?
Well, look, you know, I showed some graphs that looked at structural racism. I showed some graphs that looked at the percent of a neighborhood that the residents were Black. You know, what study after study has found is structural racism, one of its features is highly concentrated racial segregation and great disparity with respect to basically all socioeconomic indicators. So we know that that creates a set of conditions that is conducive to more violence, and police respond accordingly. They respond in part, I think it's well known that there's a racial dimension to that, but I also think that sadly, you know, we should be thinking about structural racism, not only to address police violence, but address violence overall. So yes, much of this has to do with the living conditions where all of this plays out, both violence between civilians as well as violence between law enforcement and civilians.
Thank you. So we are out of time for questions. Thank you all for who posed questions. We will try to get to your questions in the Q&A forum. But next we will have Dr. Rebecca Cunningham. She will give us some closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'm going to move my tech over here. Here we go. So first of all, thank you so much to the panel, to all of you, to our postdocs on this panel, and folks that I'm just meeting for the first time now virtually, as well as those of you that I've worked with and admired your work for years. So thank you all so much for this really interesting, timely, and important session today. And some of us were discussing in the earlier, you know, as we were getting ready for this, that firearm violence among youth in this year of overlapping pandemics is overlapping many of the pandemics that we're all experiencing. Pandemics around structural racism, pandemics around firearm violence, of major public health problems, and COVID. In our time of COVID, these things are all overlaying on top of each other and bringing them to the forefront in a way that is important to us and also feels familiar to us as firearm researchers, as we think about public health and public health crises and how those roll out across big swaths of our population, how they differentially impact people across our communities, and how the reactions to fixing them are different across our communities, and how we have to work really creatively to do that. There was so much exciting research shared today across these sessions. I'm sad that I had to pick between different sessions often at times, which is both demonstrates how much work that we have out there now. In past years, it would have been difficult to find data-filled, rigorous science abstracts to this extent, and now we have too many to even have single sessions on. I couldn't be more pleased about that, and it shows an amazing amount of development for the field. I deeply miss seeing all of you and having you interact with each other across many panels. We have people who are in the same city who realized it perhaps for the first time on the panel, who hopefully will be working together during this time and then in years to come. So we'll look forward to that, and hopefully look forward to next year having our symposium in person. You know, in some other just summary, as I think about the importance of the issues brought up today on this panel around legal incidents and youth and firearms, and then I also think about in some of the earlier sessions noting that in the time of COVID, some early research in Philly, for example, shows that firearm violence among youth is potentially up as much as 50%, if I understand that right from the abstract presented. These are important issues of our time, and it will take all of us together to be working on them.